Fine, let's start. Number 1. The Basal Eurasians. Start with the strangest fact in this entire story. There is a human population that scientists are certain existed, that shaped the ancestry of hundreds of millions of people alive today, and that has never left behind a single bone. Not a skull, not a tooth, not a fragment. We know them only because their signature is written into the DNA of other people, like a fingerprint left on a window after the hand is long gone. Researchers call them the Basal Eurasians, and they are the deepest branch on the family tree of everyone who ever left Africa. The population was first named in a landmark study led by Iosif Lazaridis in the journal Nature in 2014. The team was trying to explain a puzzle in European ancestry, and the numbers only worked if they added a hidden ghost lineage to the model. That ghost is the Basal Eurasians. They split away from all other non-African peoples very early, possibly more than 50,000 years ago, before the ancestors of Europeans and East Asians even separated from each other. Here is how we can be so confident they were real. Every non-African population that scientists have directly sequenced carries a small slice of Neanderthal DNA, usually between 1.5 and 2.1%. That DNA came from interbreeding around 50 to 60,000 years ago. The Basal Eurasians are different. They carry little to none of it. That means their line separated from the rest of us before, or right at, the moment the Neanderthal mixing happened. So how do you find a people with no remains? You use statistics. Researchers rely on tools with names like F-statistics and QP-graph, which measure the shared genetic drift between populations. When early Near Eastern farmers were analyzed, their Neanderthal signal came out strangely low. The cleanest explanation was that roughly a quarter to nearly half of their ancestry came from this Neanderthal-free ghost. David Reich's laboratory at Harvard became the center of this work, treating the human genome like an archaeological site to be excavated. Where did they live? The best guesses point to the Near East, Arabia, or Northeast Africa, somewhere their line could stay isolated for tens of thousands of years. The closest real glimpse we have came from genomes at a site called Zudzwana in Georgia, around 26,000 years old, which showed early Near Eastern ancestry with a reduced Neanderthal signal. Their ancestry finally entered Europe carried by Anatolian farmers about 8,500 years ago. Not everyone agrees on the details. Some argue the Basal Eurasians were a single population. Others suspect the label hides several deep lineages we have not untangled. But almost no one doubts the core point. Their fingerprint is strongest in the early farmers and hunter-gatherers of the Levant, and it thins out gradually into later European and Middle Eastern peoples, like dye diffusing through water. Today, the highest residual traces survive in populations of the Near East, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. It is a humbling thought that a founding quarter of some ancient farmers came from a people we have never physically held. And that sets up the thread running through everything that follows. If DNA can prove a people existed without a single bone, imagine what it can do when we actually have one. Number 2. The Ancient North Eurasians. Now go from no bones at all to the bones of one small child, and watch that child rewrite the history of 2 continents. Near Lake Baikal in Siberia sits a site called Malta, first excavated by the Soviet archaeologist Mikhail Gerasimov, starting in 1928. Decades later, the remains of a boy buried there were sequenced by Manasa Ragavan and Eske Willerslev, and published in Nature in 2013. The specimen is known as Malta 1, or simply MA1. He lived around 24,000 years ago, making his one of the oldest modern human genomes ever recovered. He was not buried casually. He wore an ivory bird pendant and a bead necklace, and his grave was dusted with red ochre. His Y chromosome belonged to a lineage called R, and his mitochondrial DNA to a lineage called U, both of which would later spread widely across Western Eurasia. But the necklace and the ochre were not the shock. The shock was in his code. The boy was related to modern Europeans. He He was also related to Native Americans, and yet he showed almost no connection to East Asians. That result landed like a thunderclap. It meant that somewhere between 14 and 38% of Native American ancestry traces back not to East Asia alone, but to an ancient population related to Western Eurasians. For over a century, some scientists had puzzled over why certain early American skulls looked unexpected. The answer was not a separate lost migration. It was this ancient mixture, hidden in plain sight. We call these people the Ancient North Eurasians. Like the Basal Eurasians, they were named from DNA before anyone tied them cleanly to a known culture, and they were not a one-off. A second set of remains from a site called Afontova Gora, around 17,000 years old, confirmed the lineage persisted across Ice Age Siberia. One of those individuals even carried a very old version of the gene for light-colored eyes, among the earliest evidence for that trait anywhere. Their reach is staggering. Ancient North Eurasian ancestry flows into later populations of the Caucasus, into the hunter-gatherers of Eastern Europe, and eventually into the Bronze Age steppe, where it makes up roughly a third of the ancestry of a people we will meet at the very end of this list. The art they left behind, including Venus figurines and carved birds, ranks among the northernmost creative work of the entire Upper Paleolithic. Think about what a single child accomplished here. One genome, pulled from one grave in the Siberian cold, connected the painted caves of Ice Age Europe to the first peoples of the Americas. And if a boy in Siberia could bridge two continents, a single infant on the edge of the last ice age could reveal an entire lost branch of humanity, all its own. Number 3. The Ancient Beringians. Travel to interior Alaska, to a site in the Tanana River Valley called Upward Sun River. There, archaeologists led by Ben Potter, beginning in 2010, uncovered the remains of two infants buried together under red ochre. The local native community gave the older child a name, Sunrise Girl Child, in their own language. In the world of genetics, she is known as USR1, and her DNA, sequenced by Victor Moreno-Meyer and S.K. Willerslev and published in Nature in 2018, revealed a people no one knew had existed. The infant lived around 11,500 years ago. When her genome was compared to living and ancient Native Americans, she did not fit the northern branch, and she did not fit the southern branch. She belonged to a third group entirely, a sister lineage to all other Native Americans. Scientists named them the Ancient Beringians. Here's what makes them so important. The Ancient Beringians split from the ancestors of other Native Americans around 20 to 22,000 years ago, but instead of pushing south into the Americas, they stayed in the frozen north. This supported a long-debated idea called the Beringian standstill, the notion that a founding population lived isolated on the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska for thousands of years before anyone moved on. The genome sharpened the whole timeline. It showed that the ancestors of all Native Americans split from East Asians around 36,000 years ago, with some gene flow continuing until about 25,000 years ago. It confirmed that Native Americans descend from a single founding source that then diversified once inside the Americas. Sunrise Girl Child herself carried a mixture of roughly equal parts East Asian and ancient North Eurasian ancestry, exactly the recipe that made the first Americans. And then the Ancient Beringians vanished. They were absorbed or replaced by later northern Native American groups, leaving essentially this one site and this one genome behind. An entire branch of the human family, balanced on the DNA of a 6-week-old child. The research also marked a turning point in how this science is done. The Tanana Athabascan communities were partners, not subjects. They helped guide the study and the eventual reburial of the children. That collaboration is now a model for the field, a sign that reading the dead carries obligations to the living who descend from them. It is one thing to sequence a genome, and another to do it with the consent and involvement of the people whose ancestors are being studied. So we have seen a ghost with no bones, a boy who joined 2 continents, and an infant who held a lost people. Now cross the world to a cave in Morocco, where the surprise is not who existed, but what was hiding inside them. Number 4. the Iberomaurusians of Taforalt. On a hillside in northeastern Morocco, there is a cave called Grotte de Pigeon, near the town of Taforalt. Inside, archaeologists including Abdeljalil Bouzougar and Nick Barton excavated a necropolis, a genuine cemetery, where people were buried with ochre and grave goods roughly 15,000 years ago. When their DNA was recovered by Marieke van de Loosdrecht and Johannes Krause and published in Science in 2018, it produced the oldest ancient human genomes then known from anywhere in Africa, and the results made no sense at first glance. 2/3 of their ancestry looked Near Eastern, closely related to a people from the Levant called the Natufians. The remaining third was sub-Saharan African, resembling modern West Africans and the Hadza of Tanzania. This was a population 15,000 years old in North Africa, built from two ingredients that supposedly should not have met yet. The obvious guess that these people simply walked across the Strait of Gibraltar from Ice Age Europe collapsed immediately. There was no European hunter-gatherer ancestry in them at all. Whatever brought that Near Eastern component into Morocco came from the east, along the top of Africa, not from the north across the sea. And this happened thousands of years before farming, proving that people, not just tools or ideas, were moving between the Maghreb and the Near East during the Ice Age. These are the Iberomaurusians, a culture defined by tiny stone blades called microliths, spanning roughly 25,000 to 11,000 years ago. They are famous for a striking custom. They deliberately removed the upper front teeth of many individuals, a practice called avulsion, likely as a rite of identity or passage. Their maternal lineages included genetic branches known as U6 and M1, both associated with ancient movements back into Africa. The sub-Saharan piece of their ancestry is especially haunting because it predates the Green Sahara, the later period when the desert bloomed and populations mixed freely. It means the connections across the Sahara ran deeper in time than anyone expected. And here's the final twist. Their exact genetic profile, that particular blend of Levantine and African ancestry, exists nowhere on Earth today. Every present-day North African carries additional layers added later. The Iberomaurusians are a genuinely lost people, a combination erased by time. From a warm North African cave, now climb into cold mountains, where a different kind of lost people spent the Ice Age hiding and quietly changed the future of Europe. Number 5. The Caucasus Hunter-Gatherers. The Caucasus Mountains, wedged between the Black Sea and the Caspian, have always been a place where things get trapped and preserved. During the last glacial maximum, when much of the surrounding world was depopulated, a small population sheltered in these mountains and stayed there, genetically sealed off, for thousands of years. We would have no idea they existed if not for two individuals from two Georgian caves. The first came from Kotias Khuld and is roughly 9,700 years old. The second came from Satserblia Cave and is around 13,300 years old. Their genomes were sequenced by Epi Jones, Ron Pinhasi, and Andrea Manica, and published in Nature Communications in 2015. Together they defined an entirely new strand of ancestry, which scientists named the Caucasus Hunter-Gatherers. Before this, researchers thought Western Eurasians were built from three main ancient sources. These two cave genomes added a fourth. The Satserblia individual in particular showed the marks of deep isolation and a very small population, exactly what you would expect from a group huddled in a refuge while glaciers ruled the land outside. This lineage had split from the Western hunter-gatherers around 45,000 years ago, and from the early farmers around 25,000 years ago. Why does a tiny hidden mountain people matter so much? Because of where their DNA went next. The Caucasus hunter-gatherers make up roughly half the ancestry of the steppe pastoralists, who would later flood into Europe. For years, scientists could see that these steppe peoples were a mixture, but they were missing one of the two parents. The Caucasus caves supplied the missing half. Their ancestry also flows into modern South Asians, carried along by later migrations, and it survives at high levels in modern Georgians and Armenians today. The Kotias individual belonged to a paternal lineage called J, and a maternal lineage called H13, both of which became common across the Caucasus and parts of Europe. And in a remarkable follow-up, scientists later recovered traces of Satsarblia-related DNA directly from the sediment on a cave floor, without any skeleton at all, blending the ghost population trick with real dirt. An entire ancestral strand, defined from just two people who spent the Ice Age hiding in the mountains. From that refuge, we move on to the open grasslands of Central Asia, to a people who were crowned as heroes of human history, and then quietly dethroned by a horse's DNA. Number 6. The Botai. On the northern plains of Kazakhstan, between roughly 3,700 and 3,100 BCE, lived a people called the Botai. Their main settlement is buried under an almost unbelievable number of horse bones, by some estimates more than 300,000. For years, the Botai held one of the most prestigious titles in all of prehistory. They were thought to be the first people on Earth to domesticate the horse. The evidence looked strong. A team led by Alan Outram, publishing in Science in 2009, reported wear marks on horse teeth consistent with bits, patterns in the soil suggesting corrals, and fatty residues in pottery pointing to the milking of mares. It was a tidy, satisfying story. The Botai tamed the horse, and from them wrote out the entire mounted history of humanity. Then ancient DNA arrived and took the crown away. In 2018, a study led by Charlene Gaunitz and Ludovic Orlando sequenced the genomes of 20 Botai and related horses. The result stunned the field. Botai horses were not the ancestors of modern domestic horses. That lineage, the one you ride today, came from somewhere else entirely. It got stranger. The Botai horses turned out to be the ancestors of the Przewalski's horse, long celebrated as the last truly wild horse on the planet. If Przewalski's horses descend from the Botai's animals, then they are not wild at all. They are feral, the escaped descendants of an ancient domestication experiment. The one horse everyone pointed to as never tamed had been tamed all along. The true ancestors of modern horses, a lineage scientists label Dom2, were domesticated later in the western Eurasian steppe near the Black and Caspian Seas. Orlando's team pinned this down in a major Nature paper in 2021, showing this lineage exploded across the world only about 4,200 years ago, spreading alongside spoke-wheeled chariots. As for the Botai people themselves, their DNA showed they carried mostly ancient North Eurasian ancestry, the same deep lineage we met in the Siberian child. They were a continuation of older Central Asian and Siberian hunter-gatherers, and they did not contribute much to the later peoples who swept the steppe. The Botai were a parallel experiment, a branch that led to a magnificent dead end. They still milked and managed horses. They simply were not the source of the animal that would carry armies and empires. There is a lesson in the Botai that reaches well beyond horses. It is the danger of assuming that the first evidence of something is also the direct ancestor of what came later. For nearly a decade, the field taught the Botai as the origin of riding, and it took genomes, not more bones, to correct the record. From a demoted people, we sail now into the open Pacific, to a founding population that was almost completely erased. Number 7. The Lapita. Scattered across nearly 4,000 kilometers of the Southwest Pacific, from Vanuatu to Fiji to Tonga to Samoa, archaeologists keep finding the same distinctive pottery, decorated with fine geometric patterns, stamped into wet clay with toothed tools. This is the mark of the Lapita, the first human beings ever to reach the remote islands of the open Pacific. They arrived between roughly 1,350 and 750 BCE in one of the fastest maritime expansions in all of history. For a long time, the assumption was simple. The Lapita must have been a blend of Asian seafarers and the older Papuan peoples of nearby Melanesia, mixing steadily as they island-hopped east. Ancient DNA blew that assumption apart. A study led by Pontus Skoglund working with the laboratories of David Reich and Johannes Krauss and published in Nature in 2016, sequenced the earliest Lapita settlers from Vanuatu and Tonga. They were almost purely East Asian in ancestry, tied to the Austronesian expansion that began in Taiwan. They carried little to no Papuan ancestry at all. Let that sink in. These voyagers had sailed straight past the inhabited islands of Melanesia, past peoples who had lived there for tens of thousands of years, and pushed on into the empty ocean beyond, barely mixing along the way. They were a founder population in the truest sense, the first footprints on brand new land. And then, they were almost entirely replaced. Later populations across those very same islands show a massive influx of Papuan ancestry, arriving in multiple waves confirmed by follow-up studies from Mark Lipson and Cosimo Post in 2018. The original, nearly pure Austronesian signal of the first settlers is barely detectable in modern Pacific Islanders. The founders were genetically swamped within centuries of their arrival. The anchor of this discovery is a cemetery called Tayuma, on the island of Ifate in Vanuatu, the largest Lapita burial site ever found, excavated by Stuart Bedford and Matthew Spriggs. The burials there are eerie and deliberate. Many bodies had their skulls removed after burial, and in some cases, the skulls were placed back on the chest of the deceased. Recovering DNA from such hot, humid, tropical ground was itself a technical triumph, once thought nearly impossible. The first voyagers of the Pacific are a vanished baseline, a people we can only reconstruct from the bones in their graves. From ocean canoes, we ride onto the grasslands of Mongolia, to an empire that history books recorded, but whose true makeup only DNA could reveal. Number 8. The Xiongnu. The Xiongnu built the first great nomadic empire of the Eurasian steppe, dominating Mongolia and Inner Asia from around 209 BCE to 98 of the Common Era. Unlike the ghost populations we have met so far, the Xiongnu were never truly lost. They were recorded, mostly by their enemies. Chinese historians, above all, Sima Qian, in his great work, The Records of the Grand Historian, described them as a constant threat, and the Great Wall of China was expanded largely to hold them back. Their founding leader, traditionally named Modu Chanyu, unified the steppe tribes around 209 BCE. So if we knew they existed, what could DNA possibly add? The answer is who they actually were. A series of studies by researchers including Jamsranjav Bayarsyken, Christina Warrener, and Chungwen Zhong, published in Science Advances in 2020 and again in 2023, sequenced Xiongnu cemeteries and found something extraordinary. The Xiongnu were one of the most genetically diverse populations ever documented from a single empire. Within the same cemeteries, individuals ranged from fully East Asian in ancestry to fully Western Eurasian, and everything in between. This was not a single people. It was a sprawling confederation that had absorbed groups from across the continent, fusing earlier steppe peoples into one political body. The 2023 study focused on 2 elite cemeteries and found that some of the highest status individuals, including women buried with gold and prestige goods in monumental tombs, carried substantial Western, Saka-related ancestry. That detail matters. It suggests that elite Xiongnu women held real political power, placed in the grandest tombs on the frontier. And the pattern of diversity followed social rank in a telling way. Genetic diversity was actually highest among the lowest status individuals, exactly what you would expect from an empire that kept conquering and incorporating new peoples at its base, while a somewhat more consolidated elite ruled at the top. The broader survey by Zhong and colleagues in the journal Cell in 2020 mapped 6,000 years of genetic history across the Mongolian steppe, showing how the Xiongnu emerged from a fusion of earlier groups with names like the slab grave culture and various Saka-related peoples. The empire ran on mounted archery, on tribute extracted from settled neighbors, and on trade along the early networks that would become the Silk Road. Isotope analysis of their bones and teeth adds another layer, revealing varied diets and high mobility, exactly what you would expect from an empire assembled from many origins. Their monumental terraced tombs for elites set against simple graves for commoners mirror in stone the same hierarchy the genomes reveal in blood. There is even a lingering question of whether the Xiongnu were connected to the Huns, who later terrorized Europe, a link that remains debated and unresolved. What is no longer in doubt is the shape of the empire itself. The old texts described a real, multi-ethnic power, and DNA has now shown just how many peoples were stitched together beneath that single banner. From a patchwork empire, we travel to a civilization of planned cities, whose entire identity hung on one fragile thread of ancient DNA. Number 9. The Harappans. Between roughly 2600 and 1900 BCE, one of the largest civilizations of the Bronze Age flourished across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. We call it the Indus Valley Civilization, or the Harappan civilization, after the site of Harappa. Its cities, including Mohenjo-Daro, Dholavira, and Rakhigarhi, were marvels of planning, laid out on grids, built from standardized fired bricks, drained by sophisticated sewer systems, and centered on structures like the Great Bath of Mohenjo-Daro. And yet, for all their achievement, the Harappans have kept one enormous secret. Their writing, the Indus script, has never been deciphered. We cannot read a word of it. For generations, that meant the identity of these people, who they were and where they came from, rested entirely on pottery, bricks, and guesswork. Ancient DNA promised an answer, but the Indus Valley fought back. The region's punishing heat destroys genetic material, and for years, every attempt failed. Success finally came from a single individual at the site of Rakhigarhi, in the Indian state of Haryana, where excavations were led by Vasant Shinde. To recover one usable genome, the team screened 61 skeletal samples, finally pulling readable DNA from a single dense petrous bone in the skull. The result was published by Vaghish Narasimhan, Vasant Shinde, and David Reich in the Journal Cell in 2019. That one genome carried a mixture of two ancestries. One was related to ancient Iranians, but from a lineage that had split off before farming even began, hinting that agriculture may have developed locally in the region rather than being imported. The other was a deep, indigenous South Asian ancestry, sometimes called the ancient ancestral South Indians. But the most consequential finding was what the genome did not contain. There was no steppe ancestry, none of the Yamnaya-related DNA that would later become so widespread in South Asia. This proved that the steppe peoples, and the Indo-European languages many of them likely spoke, arrived after the Indus civilization's peak, not before. A companion study, also by Narasimhan and colleagues in Science in 2019, sequenced 523 ancient individuals and found matching outlier genomes at distant sites, like Shar-e-Sokhta, confirming the Rakhigarhi profile was truly Harappan. The Harappan gene pool became a foundation of modern India, one of the two great sources that later mixed to form most present-day South Asian populations. This was a civilization that traded with Mesopotamia, whose seals turn up at the ancient city of Ur, and that faded around 1900 BCE as monsoons weakened and rivers shifted. And the identity of all those people, an entire civilization, was finally proven by a single fragile strand of DNA from one skeleton. From that one thread, we come to our final case, a people whose ancestry runs through perhaps half the world alive today. Number 10. The Yamnaya. On the vast grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas, between roughly 3,300 and 2,600 BCE, lived a people called the Yamnaya. Their name comes from their graves, simple pits dug beneath great earthen burial mounds called kurgans. Before ancient DNA, they were an obscure archaeological culture, a footnote of pots and mounds. Today, they are understood as one of the most consequential peoples who ever lived. The turning point came in 2015, when two enormous studies, one led by Wolfgang Hack and one by Morten Allentoft, both published in Nature, used ancient DNA to trace a massive migration out of the steppe. The Yamnaya were pastoralists, herding cattle and sheep across the open plains, using wheeled wagons to carry their lives with them. Their ancestry, it turned out, was a roughly even mixture of two peoples we have already met on this very list. Half came from the Eastern Hunter-Gatherers, and half from the Caucasus Hunter-Gatherers, hiding in their mountain refuge. Then, around 2900 to 2500 BCE, the Yamnaya and their descendants swept west into Europe. The genetic impact was overwhelming. In Central Europe, they contributed up to 3/4 of the ancestry of the corded ware culture, replacing much of the Neolithic farmer ancestry that had dominated the continent. When they reached Britain later, carried by the Bell-Beaker phenomenon, they replaced around 90% of the existing gene pool after about 2450 BCE. This migration also solved one of the oldest debates in archaeology: the spread of Indo-European languages, the family that includes English, Hindi, Russian, and most European tongues had long been a mystery. The archaeologist Maria Gimbutas had argued decades earlier that the languages spread from the steppe, and the archaeologist David Anthony laid out the case in his book, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language. Ancient DNA vindicated them. The Yamnaya predominantly carried a paternal lineage called R1b, which became dominant across Western Europe. They were tall, mobile, and organized around herds and horses. They pushed east as well as west, carrying steppe ancestry all the way into South Asia. They may even have helped spread the plague, since the bacterium Yersinia pestis has been detected in remains from this steppe world, identified by Simon Rasmussen and colleagues in 2015. Wolfgang Hack, Josef Lazaridis, and David Reich were at the center of these findings. Here is the astonishing final thought. If you have European ancestry, the Yamnaya are almost certainly among your ancestors. A people who, until a decade ago, were nearly invisible to history, now stand revealed as ancestors of half the modern world. Step back now and look at all 10 together, because the pattern they form is the real story. Look at what connects these 10 peoples, and a single shape emerges. Almost all of them were invisible to traditional archaeology. Some, like the Basal Eurasians, the ancient North Eurasians, and the Caucasus Hunter-Gatherers, were pure ghosts, defined from genetics before anyone could point to their culture. Others, like the Harappans and the Yamnaya, were known as piles of pottery and mounds whose true identity only genomes could unlock. Again and again, one skeleton, or even one infant, carried an entire vanished population inside it. The same surprises keep recurring. There is the impossible mixture, seen in the Iberomaurusians and the Xiongnu, where a single people turns out to be built from ancestries that should not have met. There is the founder-then-replacement pattern, seen in the Lapita and in the Yamnaya-driven turnover of Britain, where the first arrivals are genetically swamped by later ones. There are the refugees, the Caucasus and Beringia, that acted as engines preserving hidden lineages through the Ice Age. And there are the demotions, like the Botai, whose greatest claim to fame was quietly overturned. The same names appear over and over in the credits: David Reich, Eska Villerslev, Johannes Kraus, Ludovic Orlando, Christina Warrener. They belong to a generation of scientists who turned the human genome into an archaeological dig. Notice, too, how often a single moment of preservation made the difference. A child buried in Siberian permafrost, a cemetery sealed in a Moroccan cave, one dense skull bone that survived the heat of the Indus Plain. Each of these lost peoples clung to existence by the narrowest of margins and would have stayed invisible forever without one lucky sample. The old rule was that a lost people left only bones and artifacts, and when those ran out, the trail went cold. That rule is gone. Ancestry is an archive, carried in the bodies of the living, and it can resurrect the unseen. To understand how much we can trust these resurrections, it helps to see how the trick is actually done. Ancient DNA is a nightmare to work with. It comes in tiny, shattered fragments, chemically damaged, and almost always polluted with the DNA of everyone who has touched the bones and the microbes that colonize them. The first breakthrough was learning where to look. The petrous bone, the dense wedge of the skull that houses the inner ear, preserves DNA far better than any other part of the body, and it has become the workhorse of the field. That is the bone that finally cracked the Indus Valley. Scientists authenticate their reads by looking for a specific kind of damage. Over thousands of years, a chemical process alters the ends of DNA strands in a predictable way, and that damage pattern acts as a certificate of age, separating genuine ancient DNA from modern contamination. To read the genome, researchers either sequence everything in the sample, a method called shotgun sequencing, or fish for hundreds of thousands of informative sites using a targeted capture panel. The real magic, though, is statistical. Tools with names like F-statistics and QPADM measure how much genetic drift populations share and model any given people as a mixture of others. This is how you detect a ghost. If the math only balances when you add an unsampled source, that source becomes a hypothesis with a name, like the Basal Eurasians. Runs of homozygosity, long identical stretches within a single genome, reveal how small and isolated a population was, which is how we know the Caucasus people were a bottlenecked relic. None of this stands alone. Radiocarbon dating pins each genome to a moment in time so that migrations can be ordered correctly. Paternal and maternal lineages, tracked through the Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, add family tree detail. Scientists can now even pull human DNA straight from cave sediment. No skeleton required. The whole enterprise rests on foundations laid by the sequencing of Neanderthals and Denisovans around 2010. But a good scientist will remind you that these models are hypotheses, not photographs. They are our best current reconstruction, and that means there is still a great deal we do not know. For all these triumphs, the gaps are real and they are large. We still cannot say exactly where the Basal Eurasians lived, or even whether they were one population or several deep lineages wearing a single name. We do not know how large the ancient Beringian population was during its long standstill in the north. We cannot say for certain what language the Xiongnu spoke, since their empire spanned so many peoples, and the question of whether they were ancestral to the European Huns remains open. Other puzzles are just as stubborn. Did the Botai actually ride their horses, or only herd and milk them? Why did the earliest Lapita voyagers mix so little with the Melanesian peoples they sailed past? Where did Harappan farming truly begin, locally or by import? How violent exactly was the Yamnaya expansion into Europe, and how much was migration versus outright replacement? The DNA narrows these questions, but it rarely closes them completely. There are deeper limits, too. Our sampling is badly skewed toward places where DNA preserves well, which means cold climates are overrepresented and hot, tropical, and equatorial regions, including much of Africa, remain thin. Whole continents of the human story are still barely sampled, which means the current map is not the final map, only the parts we could reach first. Undeciphered scripts, like the Indus writing, cap how much we can ever learn about belief and daily life from genetics alone. And many family trees still have missing branches, intermediate populations we can infer must have existed but have not yet found. Genes, language, and culture do not always travel together, so a genetic migration does not automatically tell us who spoke what or believed what. Admixture models can oversimplify histories that were surely messier than any tidy diagram. And there is the ethical frontier, the responsibility of studying ancestral remains with the consent and partnership of living descendants. How many more ghost lineages are still hiding, undetected, in genomes we have not yet sequenced, is anyone's guess. What is certain is that this is not distant trivia. It is personal. Here is the part that changes how you look in the mirror. Almost every living person carries fragments of these lost peoples inside them. If your roots are European, you are a blend of ancient farmers, older hunter-gatherers, and the Yamnaya of the steppe. If your roots are South Asian, you carry the Harappan legacy layered with steppe ancestry and deep indigenous South Asian lineages. Native Americans descend from that single founding source, glimpsed in the ancient Beringian infant. North Africans carry later layers built over an Iberomaurusian-like foundation. This is exactly the ancestry that consumer DNA tests are reading when they hand you a pie chart of percentages. The deep populations on this list are the raw material of those results, and their legacy is not only ancestral bookkeeping. Real traits ride along with it, from the ability to digest milk into adulthood, to adaptations for high altitude, to immune variants shaped by ancient encounters with disease, including the plague that may have traveled with the steppe herders. This ancient variation is not just a curiosity for genealogists. It has genuine medical value, because understanding how populations adapted to famine, altitude, and infection helps explain why disease risk varies among people today. It is a strange kind of inheritance, a set of instructions written by strangers who died thousands of years before you were born. There is a quiet lesson buried in all of this. When you trace ancestry back far enough, rigid ideas about neat, separate human groups simply dissolve. Migration and mixture are not exceptions in our story. They are the rule. Every living person is a walking archive of vanished strangers. That knowledge carries responsibility, too, around who owns ancestral data, how museums display human remains, and how the origin myths of nations meet the more tangled truth written in the genome. New samples keep arriving, and the picture keeps shifting, which leaves one last thought worth sitting with. We began with a people who left no bones at all, and we ended with a people whose blood runs through half the world. Between those two poles lies a simple, startling idea. Being forgotten by history is not the same as being erased from it. These peoples wrote no books, and in most cases, we cannot read a single word they might have spoken. Yet they kept a record anyway, in the only archive that never fully closes, the living genome passed from body to body across 10,000 years, and more. There is a strange humility in this. It means our ancestors were never a single, tidy line, but a vast and tangled crowd of peoples who migrated, mixed, vanished, and survived in ways they could never have understood. Every neat origin story we tell ourselves, every clean line on a map, dissolves the moment you follow the DNA back far enough. What replaces it is something richer, a picture of humanity as a single restless, interwoven family, endlessly on the move. It means we owe our very existence to strangers who left no name, whose faces we will never see, and who are nonetheless a part of us in the most literal sense. A handful of researchers, sifting dust and fragments, have turned that dust back into people. The pace of this is not slowing. The map that looks settled today may be redrawn next year by a single new genome pulled from a cave or a grave. There is something moving in that. Something close to the feeling of finding lost family you never knew you had. The lost civilizations on this list were real. They lived, they moved, they loved and buried their dead with ochre and care. And though history forgot to write them down, a single strand of DNA still ties every one of us back to them. They were never truly gone. They were only waiting to be read.